In recent months, Wto Reform has emerged as a front page issue. And this morning on the Metro, I was just looking at some of the press, and some of the headlines include, can the WTO be saved? The WTO must reform or die. Will the US bring down the WTO? And the WTO's existential crisis. I think many of us in the room this morning would agree that 2020 is going to be a pivotal year for the WTO and maybe even a make or break it year. The WTO Director General, Acevedo, was in town earlier this week, and in his remarks at WTA, he conveyed his perspective on the challenges the WTO faces, but also the progress that is being made in Geneva. But he underscored the importance of political commitment from leaders around the world if the WTO is to be updated and transformed. And he summed up the situation ably by saying, change in multilateral institutions is hard, and it is doubly hard for institutions like the WTO, where every tweak in the rules has a concrete economic impact, threatening some interest, even if it creates opportunities for others. And I know there's a number of former and current trade officials and negotiators in the room, and I'm sure you can all relate to that quotation. Today, we hope to have a frank conversation about what are the prospects for WTO reform, what can be done to move the process forward, and what can we expect from the ministerial in June in Kazakhstan. And we will also discuss whether the headwinds the WTO faces are unique or are more in line with the challenges that other multilateral organizations are facing, as well as what role the United States will play in the coming year. And to address all these questions, we could not have a better, more distinguished group of speakers. You have their bios on your seats, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. To kick things off this morning, we are pleased to have U.S. Ambassador to the WTO, Dennis Shea, here this morning. He has been serving in Geneva just about 2 years and has quickly gained the respect of his fellow ambassadors. Before President Trump nominated him to be the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, he served for 11 years on the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Following Ambassador Shea's remarks, he will take a few questions, and then Ambassador David Walker, New Zealand's ambassador to the WTO, will then offer some remarks, to be followed by a panel of experts, and I'll introduce the other folks later. So please join me to welcome Ambassador Shea to the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Wendy. It was great to hear that you are a Metro rider. When I lived here, I was an avid user of the Metro, so it's good to hear that you're doing that as well. And it's good to be here at the Asia Society, and I want to thank you for the invitation to share some thoughts on the United States' extensive engagement at the World Trade Organization. In case you haven't noticed, everybody is talking about WTO reform these days, not only in Geneva, but in capitals around the globe. And let's remember the reform conversation, which is long overdue, would not have started and taken hold without the leadership of the United States under President Trump. After all, it was Ambassador Bob Lighthizer call for reform at the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference in December 2017 that sparked the discussion we're having today. The good news is that the United States sees potential for more responsive and effective WTO, and we are hard at work to help guide the organization toward realizing that potential. The path ahead, however, will not be easy. Achieving the goal of WTO reform will require the institution and its members to overcome some deep-rooted complacency. Complacency about the trade-distorting impact of non-market policies and practices. Complacency about the fact that so many WTO members seek to opt out of WTO rules or maintain flexibilities they no longer need, rather than embrace these rules as promoting economic development. And complacency about the failure of far too many members to fulfill basic obligations, particularly in the area of notifications and transparency. To secure a brighter future, the WTO must also reconnect to its fundamental principles: that the institution supports open, market-oriented policies across the membership, that the rules of the WTO are meant to encourage stronger economic growth for everyone, and that members should want to fully implement these rules, and that the WTO was designed most essentially as a permanent and dynamic forum for negotiations to create new global trade rules that open markets. To get the WTO back to these core principles, the United States has been working hard to advance ongoing negotiations, facilitate implementation of existing WTO rules, and bring forward new ideas and proposals on reform. I want to first talk about our work in current negotiations, and then I will discuss some of our specific reform efforts, including efforts to address longstanding concerns with the appellate body. You've heard of that, the appellate body? Okay. I want to emphasize that the United States is one of the most active WTO members, and we are engaged constructively across a range of priority interests. We often do not get credit for this, so I want to highlight a few of our efforts. I also, before I do that, I want to commend the great team of professionals I have in Geneva, not only from USTR, but from Commerce, Agriculture Department, Patent and Trademark Office, State, as well as the team of people here in Washington in the WAM office led by Dawn Shackelford, formerly led by Mark Linscott, I see over there. But they're great. We have great support and a great group of professionals supporting our work in Geneva. So what are we doing? We're working hard to secure an outcome in the fisheries subsidies negotiation by the WTO ministerial in June, believing that a successful outcome in fish has enormous institutional importance for the WTO. In a way, it won't be the WTO that saves the fish, it will be the fish that save the WTO. The fishery subsidies negotiation is, of course, an opportunity for the WTO to contribute to the sustainability of the world's oceans and deliver on a mandate established by world leaders. But as the only active multilateral negotiation at the WTO, it will also be a test whether the institution is still capable of achieving meaningful multilateral outcomes. Unfortunately, there are significant challenges in front of us. Even at this late date, as we approach the ministerial conference in June, many members remain more focused on protecting their fishery subsidies programs rather than reducing or eliminating them. For our part, the United States is aiming high to achieve meaningful reductions in these harmful subsidies and real constraints on the world's largest subsidizers. Working with key partners, the United States has put forward 5 specific proposals that would eliminate subsidies for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, prohibit subsidies contingent upon fishing on the high seas, cap and reduce the level of subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity, and prohibit subsidies for vessels not flying a member's own flag and therefore out of the control and jurisdiction of the member, and enhancing transparency by improving the notifications of fisheries subsidies. So that's 5 separate proposals we have put in at the WTO, working with other key members. The United States is also, including New Zealand, the United States is also actively engaged in the joint statement on e-commerce and digital trade, where we are advancing proposals that seek to expand access to digital technologies around the world, lower costs for businesses and consumers, and provide a more transparent and predictable trading environment. The United States has proposed rules in all key areas of digital trade, such as those related to cross-border data flows, privacy, source code, and cybersecurity to help ensure that digital trade can continue to drive economic growth and development and support the success of firms of all sizes across all sectors around the world. We've also been an outspoken supporter of a permanent moratorium on customs duties on digital transmissions, highlighting the moratorium's clear economic value. Over the past year, the United States has been working closely with other participants in the Joint Statement Initiative to produce a consolidated text by MC12 that furthers our progress toward a high-standard WTO agreement on digital trade. We have been consistent in our view that this agreement must be reciprocal, meaning that all obligations apply to all participants. We also believe that this effort can set a positive precedent for future plurilateral efforts at the WTO. The United States has been active in the ongoing discussion around agriculture. Over the past 2 years, we have been advocating for a reset of agriculture negotiations based on today's realities. To date, the U.S. has submitted 6 analytical papers that are focused on market access and tariff issues, with the intent of updating our understanding of the current state of agriculture trade and the issues that farmers are facing today. And we intend to submit more papers as part of this process. Through our engagement, we're asking members to reflect on why past negotiating efforts failed and to identify new approaches that can lower high tariffs and reduce trade-distorting subsidies and the application of non-tariff measures. Through our reset efforts, we are trying to break the bad habit of some taking the same entrenched positions and somehow expecting a different outcome. We have also repeatedly asked how the WTO would credibly negotiate disciplines on agricultural domestic support when we do not have a clear picture of what the major subsidizers are doing. In addition to these important works, the United States continues to lead in important committee work in areas such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical barriers to trade, and trade facilitation, where we seek to improve member compliance with existing commitments and to oversee the full implementation of the WTO agreements. And the United States is often the only country substantively participating in the hard and critically important work of WTO accessions. So I hope you get the picture that we are working very diligently at the WTO in a wide variety of areas. Now, turning to our efforts on WTO reform, we believe that the WTO must respond directly to the unanticipated challenges of non-market economies, those economies that fail to respect basic principles such as non-discrimination, market access, reciprocity, fairness, and transparency. The current rules leave members with insufficient tools to address these challenges. Distortions caused by non-market practices threaten the goals we share for a free, fair, and mutually advantageous trading system. Non-market practices in which governments intervene to distort competition and drive preferred outcomes to benefit certain domestic actors have led to severe overcapacity in many industries and unfair competitive conditions for our workers and businesses, and they have also undermined the public's confidence in the WTO. The concept of a market orientation for the WTO is not new, nor should it be viewed as optional by any WTO member. Those who founded the WTO had the goal of moving all economies toward market openness and free market competition. After all, the Marrakesh Declaration set out our collective intention to establish the World Trade Organization to promote participation in a world trading system, quote, based on open market-oriented policies and the commitments set out in the Earl Grey Round agreements and decisions. I've delivered multiple statements on this subject, and we are preparing to table a General Council decision that will reaffirm the importance of market-oriented conditions to the world trading system. These efforts in Geneva have been supported by work done in the trilateral process together with the EU and Japan, where we have expressed a shared view that market-oriented conditions are fundamental to a free, fair, and mutually advantageous global trading system. Our work under the Trilateral Initiative is also seeking to advance new rules around industrial subsidies, state enterprises, and forced technology transfer. The most recent trilateral statement proposed several new types of prohibited subsidies under the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. In the coming months, I look forward to working with my colleagues from Japan and the EU to discuss this proposal with like-minded members at the WTO. Now, this issue of differentiation you may have heard about. The WTO is the only economic institution that permits its members to self-declare their development status. There are no economic indicators or other measurements of what constitutes a developing country at the WTO. Countries merely need to state that they are quote unquote developing, regardless of their GDP or role in global trade, and are afforded flexibilities from WTO rules, which could take the form of transition periods, higher tariff bindings, or the ability to use prohibited subsidies, among others. The United States believes that full implementation of WTO rules benefits all WTO members, but understands that some members may still require special and differential treatment because, for whatever reason, they are not able to compete on a level playing field. But this does not justify the current situation at the WTO, where some of the world's richest and most powerful economies have claimed developing country status. It is simply unrealistic to expect any administration to accept that these countries are entitled to special and differential treatment at the WTO as a matter of right. Such a result is supported neither by economic policy nor basic fairness. So last year, the United States tabled an analytical paper highlighting how the global economic landscape has changed dramatically from 1995 to the present time. And it tells a very good story about the impact of trade on the wealth of the world. The paper shows that countries who could plausibly present themselves at the WTO as developing in 1995 can no longer plausibly do so today. The paper also demonstrates how the lack of differentiation among self-declared developing countries has severely damaged the institution's negotiating function. Following the distribution of this analytical paper, the United States then submitted a proposed General Council decision that would establish objective criteria for determining whether a WTO member may continue to avail itself of blanket, open-ended, special and differential treatment in current and future negotiations. Countries that meet any of the following four criteria under our proposal would be prevented from doing so. A WTO member who is a member of the OECD or an accession candidate to the OECD, WTO member that is a member of the G20, WTO member that is a high-income country as determined by the World Bank, and a WTO member that accounts for no less than 0.5% of global merchandise trade, meaning that they're a significant player, trading nation. Now, initially, we faced strong resistance from others to even have this discussion. But in large part, because of our perseverance, this discussion is no longer considered heretical, or the word I heard a lot was polarizing. Oh, you're being so polarizing. Other WTO members are now finally recognizing that unless we are able to differentiate between the advanced economies and those that are less developed, the prospects for new multilateral negotiated outcomes are bleak. Brazil, Korea, and Singapore recently demonstrated leadership when each agreed to forego special and differential treatment in current and future negotiations, and we believe there are others getting ready to take this important step. Ambassador Lighthizer continues to engage directly with his counterparts, and as you know, President Trump has reinforced the importance of these efforts. Another key reform initiative of the United States is improving transparency and compliance with basic notification obligations. This was a theme raised by Ambassador Lighthizer at MC11. It is difficult, if not impossible, to negotiate new rules on issues like agriculture subsidies or industrial subsidies when you do not have data on what the largest subsidizers in the world are doing. To get this kind of information, WTO members need to fulfill their existing notification obligations. Unfortunately, compliance has been woefully inadequate. Less than half of the WTO members have provided their latest industrial subsidies notification. The situation is similar for agriculture, where a third of regular notifications are outstanding. I attended the mini-ministerial in Davos, 33 members around a table. The key subject was, one of the key subjects of the meeting was fish, and I counted 11 of the 33 had not filed their fish subsidy notifications, which were due 7 months previously. We just have to do better. So the United States was the first to table a transparency proposal that establishes appropriate consequences for chronic non-compliance with notification obligations. 8 co-sponsors have now joined us, including New Zealand, and we are actively engaging other members. One of the elements of our proposal is to encourage the use of counter notifications, which is a form of peer pressure in which one WTO member notifies what it thinks another member is doing. This is a mechanism used already by the United States, but could be more widely employed by others. To improve transparency under the Subsidies agreement, the United States has submitted 5 counter notifications on China's subsidy programs. Nearly 500 Chinese subsidy measures have been counter notified in total. In addition, the United States has sought transparency in the area of agricultural domestic support by submitting 3 counter notifications on India's market price support programs for wheat, rice, cotton, and pulses. India said they provided $0 in market price support for cotton. I believe in 2016, we counter notified that the number was $8 billion. So these efforts highlight the excessive policies some members have pursued in agricultural subsidies. And any future negotiations will need to address the role of all major subsidizers, including countries like India and China. The U.S. transparency drive at the WTO is producing tangible benefits, though these efforts are often behind the scenes and not publicly noted. China's recent industrial subsidies notification was by far its most timely and comprehensive notification since becoming a WTO member. A number of countries have also submitted updated fishery subsidy notifications as a result of U.S. encouragement. So we plan to keep at it. We are also advancing work with other like-minded members to enhance transparency in dispute settlement proceedings, including making submissions publicly available and opening hearings to the public. And that brings me to our efforts to address our longstanding concerns with the appellate body. Let me start this subject by saying there is no member who has been more constructively and consistently engaged on this issue, these issues around the appellate body, than the United States. No other member. As many of you here today know well, for nearly 2 decades across multiple U.S. administrations, the United States has been raising serious concerns with the appellate body's disregard for the rules set by WTO members. Whether it's appointing its own members, engaging in fact-finding, issuing unnecessary advisory opinions, insisting that its rulings are binding precedent absent undefined cogent reasons, exceeding the 90-day deadline for issuing its rulings, and altering members' rights and obligations through erroneous interpretations of the WTO agreements, the appellate body has repeatedly broken the rules. Over the past 2 years at the WTO, the United States has outlined its concerns in exhaustive detail. If you think this speech is long, you should hear those speeches at the DSP. They're really long. We have not avoided discussion. Rather, we have laid out in the clearest possible terms the U.S. position on the issues raised. As we have explained, the fundamental problem is that the appellate body was not respecting the current clear language of the Dispute Settlement Understanding, the DSU. While a number of members have expressed concern with actions or approaches by the appellate body, and I'd like to cite Japan, Brazil, Australia as being particularly helpful, others appeared willing to tolerate or even encourage these actions. We have repeatedly made clear our willingness to discuss these concerns further with any member, in order to deepen each other's understanding of these substantive issues. But of course, engagement is a two-way street. For many months in the General Counsel and the Dispute Settlement Body, we sought to deepen members' collective understanding of the concerns raised and asked members to engage on a fundamental question. Why has the appellate body felt free to disregard the clear text of the agreements? The United States did not pose this question as part of an academic exercise. Rather, this question is critical in the context of any solution-focused discussion. Without an accurate diagnosis, we cannot assess the likely effectiveness of any potential solution. Despite the absence of meaningful engagement on the why question by other WTO members, the United States has volunteered some possible answers. For example, the virtual collapse of the WTO's negotiating function has undoubtedly contributed to unchecked institutional creep by the appellate body, as members have pushed to achieve through litigation what they have not achieved or cannot achieve at the negotiating table. It's clear that some WTO members view the appellate body as an international court and its members as judges who inherently have more expansive authority than is provided in the DSU to create jurisprudence and fill gaps in the WTO agreements. The WTO membership itself has failed, even refused on numerous occasions, to rein in the appellate body when it has departed from the clear text of the DSU. With respect to the General Counsel decisions that my friend and colleague, Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand, has put forward in Geneva, we have asked why simply repeating the existing words of the DSU would make any difference when the appellate body has felt free to act contrary to those very same words. We have not received an adequate response to that question either. Nor have members engaged when we have provided specific comments about the language contained in these General Counsel decisions. For the most part, these comments have been ignored. I will say at the October, I think it was October General Counsel decision, David put forward a draft General Counsel decision. We offered comments, and there's very little change from that draft to the draft that was submitted in December. So despite this failure of engagement by other WTO members, the United States will continue to look for ways to improve the WTO's dispute settlement system. As I've told my colleagues in Geneva, we remain open-minded, but we are not empty-minded. So to sum things up, I hope I've been able to highlight today the tremendous amount of effort the United States is putting into the WTO. The United States is actively engaged in key negotiations, seeking meaningful, high-ambition outcomes. We are there at the table, contributing to the important day-to-day committee work of the institution. We have initiated the reform conversation and provided some of the guideposts for where the organization needs to go. And yes, we're stirring things up a bit in Geneva. But as I said at the outset, we see potential for a more responsive and effective WTO, and we're working hard to realize such an institution. So that's a long speech. So I just want to thank you for your attention, and good morning. I'll take a few questions. Any hard questions go to Dawn.
Second row, red hair. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Shea, for the real tour de force of the issues on the agenda for the WTO, and really for also giving us a really deep sense of the extensive U.S. engagement on the WTO agenda, which frankly does get overlooked with the whole discussion of appellate body reform. So with that, Ambassador Shea's agreed to take a few questions. I want to take them as a group. I'm going to ask anyone who raises their hand, if you get called on, you have one question, introduce yourself, no speeches. Okay. Yes, right here.
Hi, Adam B. Sudi from Politico. There's a report this week that the U.S. was considering a withdrawal from the government procurement agreement. Can you confirm if that's actually under consideration, and is that being looked at as leverage in other trade talks with the EU, with the UK?
Okay. Other questions? Jeff?
Jeff Schott with the Peterson Institute. I was pleased to hear about all the activity on the fish subsidy negotiations, and you have a great team working on it. China is the #1 subsidizer. Why wasn't that included in the U.S.-China trade negotiations when we had leverage to get them to change their policies, as we tried to do in other areas of Chinese domestic subsidy?
Good, we're quick. Okay. Yes.
Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I wanted to, since we're talking about the U.S.-China trade agreement, there's a report out now that because of the coronavirus, the Chinese may seek flexibility or seek to invoke the disaster clause. At the same time, they've also just lowered some tariffs. I wonder if you could speak to that briefly in your understanding of that. Thank you.
Okay, one more in the back.
Hi, Hannah Monikin, Inside U.S. Trade. I just wanted to ask how the U.S. is going about convincing some of these countries to forego special and differential treatment, and who we might be seeing coming down the pike, or areas that you are concentrating those efforts in.
All right, well, thank you. You got all this down?
I think so.
If I can just add one more, maybe you can just give us your sense of the U.S. expectations and priorities for Kazakhstan. Thank you. Step aside.
Thank you. Okay, on the GPA question, I'm not going to comment on speculative stories, but the United States, it's no secret, has been looking at reviewing every trade agreement since day one of this administration. So, on U.S.-China trade agreement, coronavirus, I read the stories just the way you did. I'm going down to USTR after this. I'll see if I can get an answer, but I don't have an answer to your question. Let's see, S&D. What we're trying to do there on S&D, I know Bob Lighthizer has reached out to his counterparts. We submitted a text of a general counsel decision that had 4 categories, and about 34 countries are covered by those categories. So Ambassador Lighthizer has personally reached out to those counterparts. I meet with my colleagues in Geneva, and I did so last week and did it the week before, and just make a personal pitch that, look, you're an advanced economy, and we're not asking you to give up a past special and differential treatment, but just going forward, be an important signal for the institution, be important for the reform effort if you stepped up like Brazil, Singapore, and Korea did, and publicly commit to forgo special and differential treatment. So it's a lot of personal interactions. On U.S. I know the fish. I'm going to come back. I'm thinking about that. On the U.S. expectations for Kazakhstan, I think obviously multilateral fish negotiation. That's critically important. I think extending the moratorium on the customs duties for digital transmissions, at least for another 2 years, is critically important. I think having a consolidated text of a digital trade agreement by MC12 would be important. We hope to advance notifications, hope to advance differentiation, those issues at MC12. We may have other things we haven't fully locked down what our objectives are. So we on agriculture, we think there definitely needs to be more transparency in agriculture. So those are sort of the key things that we're thinking about. And on fish, look, this is the one multilateral at the WTO. You're right, China is a huge subsidizer. We've engaged with them directly at the WTO. We've met with them on numerous occasions because they also have a cap proposal. But they have 3 separate formulas to determine a cap, and one of the formulas is a per fisherman-based cap, which would allow for a lot of subsidy to continue. But the EU is also a big subsidizer, and as I understand it, through their legislative process, they're continuing to. They're contemplating expanding subsidies for fish by about €1 billion a year from 2021 to 2027. So our whole effort at the WTO is to reduce these subsidies, make meaningful cuts to these subsidies. So we're trying to do it. I think it's very, very important for the future of the institution that we get this done in June. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
For our next speaker, we have one of the true trade professionals with us, David Walker. Many in town may have not actually seen him, but they know of him because they've heard of this Walker paper on appellate body reform, which is really his effort as the chairperson of the dispute settlement body to bridge the gaps on this critical issue. Next month, Ambassador Walker, wanting bigger challenges in Geneva, will become chair of the WTO General Council, which is the highest decision-making body of the WTO. And there, he'll manage much of the day-to-day work, but also work on preparations for the upcoming ministerial meeting. This position is prestigious, and it's an important role for a member to play in Geneva. And it's generally given to an ambassador who's highly respected and skillful and trusted, and that is Ambassador Walker. I had the personal pleasure of working with him on the TPP negotiations when we were still part of that negotiation. New Zealand played a leading role in bringing the agreement together, both when the United States was in the agreement, but also when the United States exited. And I think a lot of that leadership and commitment to that negotiation was due to Ambassador Walker personally. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Walker to the stage.
Well, thank you, Wendy, for that most generous introduction. I was trying to work out who you were talking about. It's a great honor to be here with you all today and to have been invited to address you at this Asia Society event. At the outset, let me pay tribute to Right Honourable Mike Moore, who passed away last weekend. Mike made a huge contribution to New Zealand, including briefly as Prime Minister, to relations between our two countries as ambassador here in Washington, and internationally as the third Director General of the WTO. Throughout, Mike was a great believer in the multilateral trading system and in the power of trade and opening markets to contribute to the betterment of people's lives. The world could do with more Mike Moores, I think. It has been suggested that I talk this morning about several things. Firstly, what would make for a successful MC12 in June? Secondly, what are the prospects for WTO reform more broadly? And then where are we going on the appellate body? I will cover each of these in turn, beginning with MC12. At the outset, let me emphasize that I'm speaking here today in my personal capacity. So my comments should not be taken as necessarily representative of any New Zealand position, nor am I speaking on behalf of any WTO member, either individually or collectively, even though where some of you might hear things that coincide with things you've already heard this morning, they came from the representative of that WTO member, not me. So firstly, MC12. And here you are going to hear a little bit of similarity. For MC12 to be seen as a success, first and foremost, we need to have a successful outcome to the negotiation on fishery subsidies. Why do I say that? Well, we have been at it now that it is negotiation on fishery subsidies for almost 20 years, during which countless further damage has been done to global fish stocks. The UNCTAD Secretary General, together with the UN Special Envoy for the Ocean, and Dennis has quoted this figure before, he didn't today, but he has before, have written that nearly 90% of the world's marine fish stocks are now either fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. So the problem is urgent. It's also important. What we are dealing with is the stuff of a commitment by all leaders in the Sustainable Development Goal 14.6, and I quote, to prohibit certain forms of fishery subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and refrain from introducing such subsidies by 2020, which is this year. So that is why ministers at MC11 took up the task and called for members to negotiate an agreement on comprehensive and effective disciplines to achieve the SDG 14.6 objectives, which they could adopt at MC12. And as you heard Dennis say, it's the only multilateral negotiation that was specifically mandated from Buenos Aires. So a successful fisheries outcome is not only important for the sustainability of global fish stocks and the credibility of multilateralism at the WTO, it's also an illustration of whether WTO member governments can deliver on the commitment of their own leaders. And as one of the first SDGs to fall due, convey an important signal about the 2030 agenda more broadly. In short, I would venture that fisheries subsidies is a must-have for Nursultan. There are also some clear should-haves for MC12. It's sometimes said that the WTO hasn't done much in its 25 years of its existence. Although those of us who waited decades for the elimination of agriculture export subsidies might beg to differ. One of the first things it did do, though, way back in 1998, was to recognise the significance of the emerging digital world in agreeing the moratorium on the imposition of customs duties on electronic transmissions. That step has been commonly recognised by business as providing important predictability and is one of the developments which underpinned the explosive growth we have since seen in digital trade. There remains important work to be done, including multilaterally at the WTO, to understand the full dimensions and potential of digital trade. So I imagine that businesses and consumers alike would find it odd, to say the least, if WTO members, being part of an organisation where they look to achieve shared objectives through, and again I'm going to quote, entering into reciprocal and mutually advantageous arrangements directed to the substantial reduction of tariffs and other barriers to trade, and to the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international trade relations, it would be pretty odd if those members did not agree to further extend the e-commerce moratorium together with that on TRIPS non-violation complaints. In short, if you subscribe to the bicycle theory of international trade, bicycles usually don't work too well if you try to pedal them backwards. Another multilateral should-have at Nursultan is to return to a meaningful way forward in the long-standing negotiations on agriculture reform. Heard it said that one ministerial conference without anything on agriculture was unfortunate, two would be careless. Commonly identified priority here is trade distorting domestic subsidies. As Ken's group ministers pointed out recently at Davos, trade distorting domestic support entitlements are now over US $700 billion per year. And unchecked, the entitlement of just the 9 largest subsidizers could reach over $1 trillion by 2030. A deal needs to be struck here before efficient and sustainable agricultural producers everywhere subscribe to the rising tide of trade distorting subsidies from wherever they come. And of course, a trading world in which the average tariff on agricultural products is 5 times that on industrials can hardly be described as fair. Beyond this, there are a range of other should-haves, could-haves at MC12. Multilaterally, transparency is central to the implementation and monitoring of members' WTO commitments. Yet, as you've again heard this morning, compliance with notification obligations is patchy at best and noticeably lacking in some key areas such as subsidies. Ministers at Nur-Sultan will hopefully be able to find ways to enhance compliance with existing notification obligations. What those ways are remains a work in progress. In addition to the multilateral agenda, a number of joint initiatives were launched at MC11 by interested members. While open to all WTO members, participation in these initiatives typically numbers less than the full WTO membership. Participants in the Services Domestic Regulation Initiative are aiming to conclude an agreement by MC12, with the results of that agreement reflected in their GATS schedules. Participants in initiatives on electronic commerce, digital trade, and investment facilitation are each looking to make substantive progress at Nur-Sultan in some as yet undefined form. That brings me to the question of the prospects for WTO reform more broadly. 25 years on, the objectives of the WTO, as articulated in the Marrakesh Agreement, remain as valid as ever, and I commend everybody to go and take another look at those. But to further advance those objectives, members need to update and modernise their commitment and WTO rules, both in areas of unfinished business in the traditional WTO agenda, such as agriculture, and to expand the agenda to reflect the business environment of the 21st century. As well as technological developments such as the digital world, issues of inclusion and sustainability have risen to the top of public policy agendas in many countries and internationally. Consequently, it's increasingly important for the WTO to be able to articulate a narrative and point to outcomes in both these areas. In the area of inclusion, joint initiatives on MSMEs and women's economic empowerment provide the opportunity to do this at Nur-Sultan. In the area of sustainability, the outcome of fish subsidies will be a signal achievement. But the SDG agenda and its relevance to the multilateral trading system is much broader than SDG 14. Further work will be required on issues such as energy and climate, including fossil fuel subsidy reform, and waste circular economy. A range of members will be looking to promote such activity at and beyond MC12. Development, with a capital D, remains an area of contention and potential divisiveness. Advancing sustainable development through trade has to be the central rationale for any government in being a member of or seeking to join the WTO. As far as I understand, there continues to be a shared commitment to the Marrakesh Agreement recognition that, and again I quote, there is a need for positive efforts designed to ensure that developing countries, and especially the least developed among them, secure a share in the growth of international trade commensurate with the needs of their economic development. There also seems to be broad recognition that the developmental picture in the year 2020 is not the same as it was in 1995. Coming to a shared understanding of how to achieve greater differentiation or focus in the granting of such positive efforts, special and differential treatment as it's usually termed, commensurate with economic development needs though, and both of those things are in that recognition in Marrakesh. Coming to that balance remains elusive at this point. A way forward, and you heard this again directly this morning, a way forward on this issue is seen by some as essential if we are again to see broad momentum in the negotiating function at the multilateral level. And in addition to the long tilted playing field in agriculture, a range of WTO members, including the EU, Japan, US trilateral, are seized of the need to address non-market behaviour and consequent trade distortions caused by subsidies on industrial products. these topics are being discussed, both within the WTO and in various other fora in which some WTO members are involved, such as APEC, OECD, G7, and G20. How such discussions might coalesce by MC12, i.e. what might come together by Nur-Sultan, and what might be identified for post-MC12 activity in the WTO, is too early to see, but clearly will be a key part of the mix for the WTO this year and beyond. Finally, a few words on the appellate body issue. As you all know, as of 10 December 2019, the appellate body is down to only one sitting member and therefore unable to form a division to hear any new appeal initiated after that date. There is also a pipeline of pending appeals that were filed ahead of that date, but not yet heard. Since then, i.e. since 10 December, in the DSB, one panel, that in a dispute between Australia and Indonesia, has been adopted, and one appeal was initiated. The appeal involved a dispute between India and the United States, and the two parties reached a bilateral understanding about how they would treat the situation, which was communicated to the DSB. Also in the DSB, some 120 members now continue to call for the immediate launch of the selection process to fill vacant positions on the appellate body, with the United States, and I'm sure they won't mind me quoting this, not in a position to support such DSB action. Some of those 120 members issued a statement at Davos on the 24th of January, announcing that they would work towards putting in place contingency measures to allow for appeals and disputes among themselves, a multi-party interim appeal arrangement based on DSU Article 25, pending restoration of a fully operational appellate body. On that front, the draft decision on the functioning of the appellate body that I submitted to the General Council on 9 December as facilitator was broadly supported but did not achieve full consensus. That draft decision was developed through a process amongst delegations aimed at improving the functioning of the appellate body consistent with DSU rules. I indicated that I would remain available to assist members in that endeavour, and I continue to look to do so with colleagues in Geneva. The WTO Director General also announced that he would be undertaking high-level consultations, which may involve issues beyond those that we have sought to address in the General Council process to date. The objective of members, as I understand it though, remains to restore a fully functional dispute settlement system at the earliest opportunity. Thank you again for the opportunity to address you today, and I look forward to the upcoming panel session. Thank you.
Wow, we have a lot on the plate, and several people are thinking of questions. But first, I'm going to ask a few. But before I do that, I would like to introduce the other two panelists. To my right is Yoichi Suzuki. We're very pleased to have him with us. He's been a longtime Japanese trade negotiator. He was brought in the final stages of the Japan-EU FTA negotiations to close the negotiations. They've been going on for years and years. Yoichi joins, and months later, they're concluded. You decide. I've also had the opportunity to work on bilateral issues with Yoichi, including on beef and insurance. And I think as a result of that, he became even more interested in working on multilateral issues. So thanks for being with us. And Rufus Yerxa, I don't really think we need to introduce him to any stage in Washington, D.C. He has been a great colleague, a great friend, and frankly, a great negotiator as deputy USTR, also as the U.S. ambassador to the WTO, and then working for the WTO itself. So I think we have an incredible panel here, and I'm going to just ask a few questions, and then I really want to open it up to people in the room. So let me start with Yoichi. And here I just want to ask kind of a broader question, taking a step back. It seems like a lot of the international organizations, particularly the ones coming out of Bretton Woods, are undergoing stress in one way or another. They're facing challenges. It's not easy. Technology is changing things. The mandates are changing things. There's more members and emerging members. And so my question for you is the WTO, is it part of all of this, or does the WTO, in fact, face additional challenges that make its mission now even more acute and more unique?
Well, thank you, Wendy, for your nice introduction. On the Japan-EU thing, I'll just say one thing. I was able to, in fact, conclude it in a few months. I was tremendously helped by two elements. One was President Trump's announcement to withdraw from the TPP, and the other was the referendum on Brexit. That actually helped a lot on both the Japanese side and the European Union side to conclude the negotiation quickly. On your question, first, I would like to say that WTO so far achieved a tremendous amount of results. I mean, we all know that before the WTO was launched, the World Trade System was on a provisional basis. We didn't have a permanent organization. We didn't have a permanent fora for continuous negotiation. WTO created that, and the result is not too bad. We have a more permanent, more previsible, more foreseeable framework. We were able, I mean, as was discussed, I mean, we have a problem with agricultural subsidies, domestic support, but the all-around results implemented by the WTO did achieve a lot in reducing agricultural subsidies, particularly in the developed part of the world. Trade has been growing constantly faster than the economy. I mean, the trade has been pulling the economy for a very long time until about a few years back. So it was always about 50% more, growing more than the economic growth. I mean, the poverty has been reduced importantly, and the share of the developing countries' trade in the world trade increased by about 10% from 30 to 40. And the world average tariff rate came down considerably, I mean, from somewhere around 40% to around 10%. So the achievement has been tremendous. The question is, WTO has stopped evolving for various reasons. Since its inception, we failed to conclude negotiation, we failed to review processes, and there are things that are hampering the WTO right now. For example, I mean, we thought that single undertaking was the way to go forward. Decision-making by consensus was also another way to bring all developing countries on board and make everybody sort of committed to the result of the WTO and say committed to its implementation obligations and so forth. But consensus-based decision is actually not helping us at all. Single undertaking perhaps may not have been the way after all these years. And the fact that those who have negotiated the WTO know that WTO was a forum to provide a continuous negotiation, but those who joined the WTO later may have this idea, as was mentioned by both Dennis and David, that WTO is a place to apply rules rather than an evolving forum for continuous negotiation. So strict application of the rules in a way that was not envisaged by the negotiators actually is not helping anybody at this point. But I think the fundamental question is, as has been alluded by Dennis, the question is, when WTO was launched, we didn't have the problem of the existence of non-market economy. a huge non-market economy. And market-oriented sort of basis of the WTO is under tremendous challenge by the appearance of a very strong player, which is operating on a socialist economic model or non-market economy. And the question is, what do you want to do with this? You want to change the nature of WTO to bring them in, or be patient so that the transformation would continue for the non-market economy to become a market economy? I'm rather sort of doubtful about this. So I think the way to go forward is accept the fact that there is a strong non-market economic entity in the world operating not quite under the system, the rules that was envisaged when the WTO was negotiated. What do you want to do with this? And that's, I think, is the biggest challenge we're facing, and we have to solve this. We can't just separate the world economy. Thank you.
Rufus or David, do you want to add anything?
Another question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I can ask you other questions. Sure. I just want to... All right, Rufus, here's one for you. So both Dennis and David have kind of outlined priorities or expectations for, I guess we're now calling it the MC12. For everyone in the audience, I was trying to remember what MC stands for. Ministerial Conference. Yeah, okay. You're president of the National Foreign Trade Council. Maybe you can just share with us what are U.S. business priorities? What are they looking for to come out of Kazakhstan in order for it to be successful in their eyes?
Yeah, thank you, Wendy, and thanks for putting on this very important forum at this time and all the great participants. David talked about the bicycle theory, which of course all of you have heard about. He mentioned that it doesn't work so well if you try to go backwards, but actually I agree with that. But the bicycle theory also says of the three possible things you can do, go backwards, stand still, or go forwards. The only way the bicycle doesn't dysfunction is if you go forward. And I don't think there's any question that we need to find a way to go forward. The interesting thing about Dennis's speech today was how much I think of what he summarized, not just for Kazakhstan, but longer term reform, really reflects a lot of the thinking of U.S. business about where the system ought to go. As you know, the companies I represent have had various criticisms and concerns about certain directions administration trade policy has taken, but to see the administration taking seriously the desire to push the WTO system in the right direction on some very difficult issues. And I could just go down the list. Obviously, as you probably know, on e-commerce and the digital economy, there's a very, very strong support from just about all American businesses. It's not just the e-commerce companies, it's manufacturers, it's service companies, it's food producers, it's everybody who feels that these are critical to get rules that ensure that we don't have the kinds of eras of protectionism in the new digital age that we had in the old economy. So there's a lot of support there. There's a lot of support on things like making the system work better, transparency and notifications. There's a lot of support clearly for moving, and this is going to take longer than what we can achieve next year or even in the next few years, but a real agenda on subsidies reform and on dealing with industrial subsidies, on dealing with the problems of too much government involvement in the economy, how state-controlled entities are working. It's a very, very real problem for the system, and one we need to work on. Obviously we want to see a successful meeting in Kazakhstan. We also think that, you cannot expect a system that is this big and takes this much time to negotiate to fix everything in a short-term agenda. So real markers of progress that restore confidence in the system and allow us to go forward. Not a lot of my companies are involved directly in fisheries, but we share the view that a successful fisheries agreement along the lines Dennis outlined is really very, very critical to not only showing that the bicycle can go forward, but to showing that it can deal with issues even if it's not pure commercial interests that drive those issues, but also the broader interest of sustainability and solving real global problems. So we, on balance, think the U.S. has made a good faith effort here to really engage. A lot of other countries are starting to do the same. I applaud the trilateral process that the three have had to focus on some of these issues. By the way, I didn't mention the e-commerce moratorium. That goes along with what I said on the digital economy. Very important to my companies. Now, what I want to say on the other side, though, is a little harder and a little more difficult conversation with the administration. When, as you all know, we've been very, very critical of the position that's been taken on the use of national security restrictions, that we view those as, in the long term, undermining the other rules of the system. And what we would urge our own administration to think about is, what good would it do to completely fix a lot of the imperfections in the system for subsidies, for non-market economies, for a lot of other important objectives we have, but then give all of the countries of the WTO system a roadmap which says if you use the two words national security, you can take any restriction you want on trade, and it's not even reviewable by the rest of the membership. To me, that's an untenable position for the U.S. to take, and hopefully, as we move towards better reform of the system, we will move away from that concept of using national security as an excuse for evading the disciplines of the system. The last thing I would like to say, I'll save my comments on the appellate body issue until maybe we get into that, but I do want to say something about special and differential. On balance, I very much agree with what the administration is saying about it's not really logical in this day and age with large emerging economies with very, very powerful capabilities for international trade to be relying on special and differential treatment, which was really designed for the least and less developed countries. I think the one thing I would say is if you actually go through the rules of the WTO and look at it on an issue-by-issue basis, there's really not that much in the existing rules that special and differential treatment alone delivers to you. There are a few areas. Many of the S&D provisions were transitional, and we've passed those transitional stages. There are a few areas. There's some stuff in agriculture, which obviously is important. There's some stuff in trade facilitation. The real problem with S&D for developing countries isn't so much their self-declaration. It's the fact that in market access commitments, like tariffs and the GATT schedules and other things, developing countries, because of the history of how the negotiations in GATT and WTO evolved, stayed out of a lot of commitments. And that has carried forward into the present day. And so, Dennis got towards the end of his remarks, I think it's really important for us to have an ambitious U.S. set of objectives in getting market access commitments, in making sure that we continue the process of getting tariffs down around the world and getting better services commitments. So just quickly back to Nur-Sultan, like I said, limited expectations for huge progress there. Obviously, fishery subsidies is critical. We want to see a consolidated text on e-commerce. We want to see a roadmap in other areas, which we can talk about further.
David, a question for you. I saw you nodding when Rufus was talking about taking like an incremental approach and you can't do it all. At the same time, you know, there are big challenges facing the WTO, and this administration a bit impatient. And the notion you're going to wait years to address all of these issues. How do you square the circle in terms of what can really be achieved in Geneva? And are there things that can be done that help build the momentum? And so, you know, they pave the way for more happening quickly after.
Well, I definitely agree that you can't do everything at once. And it's not a good idea to try. Try to overload the system and overload the expectations, then you do tend to the risk of the break part of your title, which is in no one's interest, as I can see it. So I think it's much more about on the make side, but making does take a little bit of time. Definitely getting the achievement of fish, I think that really helps with the confidence. And of course, the moratorium carries on through. And I was trying to lay out on the other areas how you might create a bit of a more focused agenda for taking forward over the next, I don't know, months or so, following on from Nursultan to try and, you know, get to some actual deliverables in those areas. Agriculture is of interest to a lot of people. The WTO, if you look back at the WTO, coming out of the Uruguay round, you had two topics of ongoing reform: agriculture reform and ongoing services negotiations. The first thing they did, as I said, was they added digital to it. Haven't done much, but they added it, and a really potent initial step on it. Then you had the overlay of the Doha round, and of course the rest is history. So some of those things are still there as clearly unfinished business, and agriculture is topic number one. On the joint initiatives, I think the services domestic regulation is sitting there not as only as important in economic terms and for business, but that's a proof of concept. There's a group, these are kind of, what are they, coalitions of the willing, members who want to move ahead and actually do stuff. So these members have said, we're going to have an agreement on Nursultan. So, you know, let's hope that happens. On some of these big reform areas about, you know, extending the contract and about reshaping it, then I think what we do need to do is try and lay some constructive seeds at Nursultan, which give us some areas of direction, some points of initial focus, and some targets of when ministers expect us to be producing results. And a lot of language matters in a lot of things like that. So I think underneath there's probably quite a lot more willingness to address some form of a differentiation discussion, provided it's not on the label of who is a developing country. And then you might have heard in what I was saying in my remarks on this issue of market or non-market. I was trying to steer away from saying someone is a non-market economy or someone is a market economy. These labels, A, they don't really matter in substance, but B, they matter a lot to people when they're on the receiving end of them. So what I was looking at was concentrate on the policies, and in particular look at the non-market behaviour and trade distortions, the consequent trade distortions that result from policies like subsidies, and then tackle the actual policy, which, you know, some of these proposals are starting to look to do. So don't expect Rome to be built in a day, and let's try and be a little bit sophisticated about how we construct the roadmap forward.
Good. The floor is open. The same rules apply. Yes. And again, if you can introduce yourself and limit to one question. although I know who that is, but I'm going to let you introduce
Thank you.
yourself.
Mireya Solis from Brookings. I wanted to ask Ambassador Suzuki, Japan was not part of the 33 countries that signed on to that contingency plan at Davos for how to deal with the lack of operation of the dispute settlement, the appellate body in particular. Could you explain why that was the case? And also we heard from Ambassador Shea.
One question.
Oh, well.
But I'll let you, Maria. Go
Okay,
ahead.
just very quickly. Ambassador Shea offered his diagnostic as to why the appellate body is not working. And we also know from other members they have answers as to how to fix the appellate body. So what is Japan's thinking on the why, the diagnostics, and the how on to fix the appellate body? Thank you, Wendy.
Let's take a few more. Over here. Dorothy.
Hi, Dorothy Dwoskin, D2 Strategies. So thanks for your comments, all very interesting. I get that fish is really important. It's important to do something about sustainability for the WTO to play a role there. I get that agriculture is really important, but it kind of seems like the players who are having the most problems with those issues are going to want something to look at the balance there, that saying that they're going to do something on fish is going to be a really hard thing to do, and same with agriculture. So what's the other side? What are those players looking for at the, for MC12 and going forward in terms of trying to show that the folks back home that they've got something that actually works? Thanks.
One more question, then we'll turn to the panel. Yes. Oh, wait 1 second. We'll get you a microphone.
Hi, my name is Hangju from Chinese Embassy. My question to Ambassador Walker. As a present chairperson of the dispute body and the incoming person for General Counsel, I just want to make some general question, like housekeeping. You are the housekeepers. What do you think the challenge issues on the appellate body, and what are you going to do when you become the chairperson of the General Counsel to reach the consensus of 164 members? So WTO is in a big crisis. How do you restore confidence for the members?
I think one thing he's not going to be doing is sleeping. Okay, so we have 3 questions. Yoichi, you want to start with the question on why Japan didn't join the other countries in Davos? Well, and can you just explain the issue as well?
Well, with the departure of the remaining members, there's only one member left in the appellate body, and the appellate body system, the appeal system, is not working anymore. So if you want to safeguard the possibility of appeal, you have to find out an interim arrangement so that there's a possibility of appeal. And that was essentially, I think, the purpose of the Davos sort of agreement on providing some sort of even ad hoc, on an ad hoc basis, an appeal process. Why Japan didn't join, I really can't speak for my government because I left the government, but from what I understand, Japan is still, instead of directly supporting the initiative, is trying to find a way to fine-tune some of the elements that Japan thinks is important. For example, of the roster, how do you select the mediators out of the outgoing appellate body members? What kind of minimum discipline you want them to respect? I think these are the things that are important instead of just providing an opportunity for appeal. So Japan is not entirely, as far as I understand, against the idea, and it's not because of that we have not joined immediately, but Japan thinks that there's still time we can think about some refinement, some more discipline to add to this ad hoc process, and I think the thinking is right now going on.
Okay. David?
To Dorothy's question, fish, I think people genuinely are looking at it a little bit differently in its own box for its own merits because of the link to the fact that it is a leader's commitment. There are big issues still to be resolved in there, as you heard from Dennis. The real trick, I think, to getting an outcome there is that all the major subsidizers have to make a real contribution to disciplining and prohibiting the most harmful subsidies and finding a way to make remaining subsidies more sustainable. And at the same time, we need also to give some confidence to a great many WTO members for whom they're not involved at that big end of town fishing, but fishing is important at the more subsistence and artisanal level for their coastal communities, and how to bring all that together. I think that is potentially the way to do fish without it being linked to other things. Agriculture, definitely there are some self-balances in there, but there are linkages to broader agendas, and everybody has their own agenda. Some of the joint initiatives are very strongly advocated by China and others, for example, on the investment facilitation one, and where that might go, I don't know. If you look at what my Chinese colleague says in Geneva, he puts a great store on multilateral process and multilateral disciplines. So if we can take forward a discussion which is about strengthening, expanding multilateral rules and having them monitored, implemented and enforced within the multilateral context, I think that he sees that as a potentially very productive thing to be doing. So there are potentially coincident interests here in taking forward reform. It's about how to get beyond the rhetoric, the shaping things up, and say, well, okay, everybody's attention now, so what are we going to do about it? And construct a meaningful way forward. That's kind of really where we are at the appellate body. We have had a very active process of engagement throughout this past year, which Dennis and his team have been very actively involved in. He is right, those speeches in the DSP, they are very, very long, they're very detailed, and they set out in great detail what the problem is according to the US diagnosis. And in many cases, large elements of that are shared by other members, which is why you see that General Council decision in the first place. If it wasn't a shared endeavour, you wouldn't see that draft decision. It didn't get to consensus, but it was and it remains an effort to try and make the system work within the rules. There weren't many, but some of those adjustments between October and December, despite what I said, they were only slight. You have to just work things through. They were pretty significant. One of the most significant was the recognition right up front that there's a problem. To get members to that point where they were all prepared to sign on and say there was a problem, that took a lot of work, but that was there in December. And the other thing that's there is a real mechanism which doesn't exist at the moment to try and hold the system to account for the implementation of it going forward. Not just appellate body members, but WTO members as well. In the middle, you've got some instructions and guidance, and clearly, there's potential maybe to do a little bit more there in order to land some things. What I call the process bits, the 90 days and the transition. If you read that carefully, I think that's pretty much sorted. There's a couple of the interpretive bits there, which still maybe there's a little bit of unfinished business in that discussion around the sort of balance of Facts Article 11 and the way we're talking about precedent and cogent reasons, for example. And if if we have a little bit more quiet discussion about the whys, that things like that might have evolved over time, we might have a bit more shared understanding about what we could do to fix those that everybody was prepared to sign up to and make happen. And it's that trust and confidence amongst members, not our trust and confidence with the appellate body, but trust and confidence in ourselves that we're going to implement and hold people to account if we agree something. That's what's still missing. The other thing which the process did not address, because it's outside its scope, is are there legacy issues from some of those past interpretations that need to be fixed through the legislative, the negotiation, joint interpretations, that type of route. And maybe there are, and maybe we're starting to see some of that come forward. And if you want to see all this talk about crown jewels, the crown jewels of the multilateral trading system are actually the rules and their good faith implementation. The dispute settlement system sits there to assist members in resolving issues that arise, if they arise with that implementation. But at its heart, it's about the rules and good faith implementation. So I think there's wide recognition that we need to get back in the rulemaking business, and we need to have that dispute settlement function fully functioning for if and when we need it. So I think people are still committed to do that, but exactly how and when, I couldn't sit and tell you here today.
Other questions? Do you want to?
Well, no, I'll wait for the.
You can. I'll turn to you first on this one, and then you can.
Yeah, I had one comment, but.
As Terry Stewart, now retired. This is for David. At MC10, of course, India had some very important agricultural issues that it wished to have addressed. It continues to believe that carried through MC11. And I didn't hear either Dennis or you talk about the likelihood of those being on the agenda at MC12.
Other questions? Take two more. Yes, right back there, just over there. Oh, no, yeah, right there.
Hi, Inu Malnik from the Cato Institute. My question is regarding the appellate body and what's going on in terms of the interim agreements that some members are putting together to kind of get around the fact that we don't have an appellate body right now. So with these Article 25 arbitration panels that we might see, what's going to happen with any sort of precedent that they might establish, or will they ever create any sort of precedent that can be used later in some appellate body ruling? Will they be cited to? And how does this work? Do we create two parallel tracks of WTO jurisprudence if these panels are successful? And if this Article 25 workaround is successful, what incentive does the United States have to ever reconvene and reconstitute the appellate body instead just leaving these as is? Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Someone who hasn't asked one? Okay, so let me first turn to Rufus.
One more question.
Oh, yeah, but he asked one already.
Yes, one.
Rufus.
So, yeah, I thank you, Wendy. I wanted to go back to Dorothy's point, which I think is a very, clearly one from somebody who's been through major WTO reform negotiations, because, there was this great sort of line of argument that we heard a lot of after the sort of demise of the Doha round, about how the real problem was that these great big rounds would never work because they're too big and too cumbersome, and the way to negotiate now is on specific issues and, have targeted negotiations on this issue and that issue. But, you know, I think it's pretty clear that if you really want to get comprehensive reform, everybody participating in that process is going to put something on the table. I remember during the Uruguay round when my mother came to visit me in Geneva, and she sort of politely asked me at dinner about what exactly was the Uruguay round. So I started this tedious explanation of, you know, the U.S. wanting all this stuff on intellectual property and services, and U.S. and Karen's group wanting an agriculture agenda, developing countries wanting textiles, the market access negotiations, and it's, you know, our eyelids began to droop, and she got, you know, trying to pay attention. She finally, at the end of it, said, well, I really just have one question. Why is it round? But I think the point is, we should definitely expect that that's exactly what's going to happen out of all this process, and we're going to have to cope with what that means. I have a comment on pellet body, but I'll wait till others, however you want to do that.
Yeah, David, do you want to respond to?
Okay, so Terry, you seem to be very active in retirement. Thanks for posting your copy to me. I read them all. India and the public stockholding issue, that hasn't gone away, but neither has the discussion really progressed much. As you know, there's the interim solution from Bali, and then the search for a permanent solution. The discussion from the skeptics has been, okay, we need a bunch of safeguards around this to ensure that it would be a mechanism which is genuinely directed at food security and not feeding into trade distorting behaviour, of which there's considerable risks if you were to structure it in a bit of an open way. On the other side, I haven't been in those discussions myself for a little while, but last time I was, there was no real engagement with those questions around the safeguards. So I don't know whether it's because people are quite happy with the situation that it is. Situation's changed a bit since last time we looked at it, because of course there've been some dispute activity, and there've been a little bit of attempt to throw some spotlights around on some of it, as you heard from Dennis. So there may be a bit more energy in that discussion coming to being part of the mix of the way forward from MC12, but too early to tell. On the AB and the effort that some might be working on to make up their own temporary workarounds, they can't generate anything that you would label as precedent. You look at the draft decision, it's very clear that everybody agrees there is no binding precedent in the WTO dispute. In the system as it's centrally constructed, there's certainly interest in predictability and interpretation, because that's important for everybody. And what we said by way of guidance is a sort of a bottom-up process, that if a panel or subsequent panel or appellate body comes across something which has been ruled on before, and it's sort of the same or very similar set of facts and circumstances, they should take into account what's been done before to the extent they find it relevant to the case they have before them, which is a bottom-up way of looking at the jurisprudence, if you like. 25 arbitration, that takes you outside of that system. And it's not clear, I think, where you get to. I understand that the participants in this process might be trying to build some of those procedural steps in as guidance to whoever is an arbitrator. But it's a system that's rather aside from the central flow of panels and appellate body.
Perhaps I can just wrap this up with one last question, kind of a bigger picture question to everyone on the panel, and just going back to something that Director General Acevedo said earlier this week, and that is that if WTO reform is really going to happen, it can't happen just with the work in Geneva. You need senior level engagement from capitals. And I guess my question to each of you is, do you agree? And assuming you agree, do you think there is sufficient senior level engagement? And if not, how do you get it? And, do things need to get worse before they get better? Who wants to take that first? Rufus.
I think it was, my answers would be yes, yes, and yes.
Okay, but, I can't remember each question. Don't do that to me.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, at various points in the process, both in launching negotiations, in making, critical progress at sort of interim stages of the negotiations, and in ending the negotiations, it takes a huge amount of political will and political capital. Also, what I would call political trust between governments, and that trust deficit may be our biggest problem right now. But it will take everybody recognizing that there's a sense of purpose to all of this, and that they want to get it done, and that the consequences of not getting it done are worse. I don't think we're anywhere near that point yet, but I don't see why that couldn't develop. And it goes back to this point about why you end up with a large negotiation with a lot of issues on the table, because in order for that political will to develop in all the major capitals, if you start to think about how do we end up with an end game scenario where Beijing and Brussels and Washington and Brasilia and a whole bunch of other countries, Wellington and others all want to say this is a winner for us, and we've all got a good reason to do it. So that is going to be taken. Can I just say one thing on the appellate body real quickly?
Go for it.
People wonder where U.S. business is about this. Obviously, I strongly agree with what David said about the real crown jewel here is the rules, and if you don't have some effective system to give credibility to those rules and create binding rulings, you've got a problem. And we definitely think that that's needed, and we should solve this problem. On the other hand, I've got to tell you, there's no doubt, and maybe this is a comment I'm making for any of the government officials in the room, the fact that there are press in the room, they're going to report it, so be it. But I have to tell you, first of all, I was the U.S. negotiator in the room when we negotiated the final anti-dumping agreement. People who know me know that I'm not exactly a big fan of some of the U.S. laws and methodologies on dumping, because a lot of the industries I represent are exporters and have problems with the way those laws work, and we have internal disputes about that. But what the U.S. law is on something like this isn't the real issue. The reason there's a problem with the appellate body is the question becomes, what was the international agreement in the room on those rules? And I can tell you for a fact that the international agreement in the room was, first of all, that there was no agreement on a methodology like zeroing. There was on a lot of other things. We got deals on accumulation and de minimis and a bunch of other things. And there was also language which we put in there, which I tabled, about where the agreement is ambiguous, there can be different interpretations. My point in saying all this is there clearly needs to be a different approach to how the appellate body views its responsibilities and how it interprets agreements. If you think you can have a court in Geneva that is going to decide every single issue of every single piece of methodology of every country's implementation of complex rules and regulations, this system isn't going to work. It's got to be something else. I don't have all the answers, but I think U.S. business is broadly supportive of something that is reasonable, and I would urge other governments in the room to be thinking about this, because what we ought to be doing is making sure those rulings really speak to the much, much larger systemic problems that government's policies create?
David?
On those various questions that you asked on the last one, I certainly hope it doesn't have to get worse before it gets better. Because if you listen to what the Director General is saying now, he's clearly pretty concerned about the state of affairs and the risks that we have in trying to get to the point where we can make the system work better and getting there fast enough. Capital involvement is essential. We as ambassadors, we're sitting in Geneva, we're not sitting there as just our individuals, we're sitting there as representing our member governments. So we take our instructions from our capitals. The important thing in capitals is you've got a coordinated governmental position as a whole. So for example, at home, big negotiations, they have to go through a cabinet process to get a mandate from the cabinet. And then at the end, they have to get signed off and then sometimes ratified through Parliament. So you have to have your coordinating system in capitals functioning. Then, it's an interesting balance. I'm a great believer that we should not delegate unnecessarily upwards to capitals. WTO agreement, we as the General Council, we are the ministerial conference operating between the sessions. So we can do a lot in Geneva in terms of the powers that are given to the members there, and we should get used to doing maybe a bit more of that. But we also need to be preparing the ground so that when we do need to engage directly the political level, that things are prepared for those ministers or others to come in to be able to make decisions on what should happen. If we haven't done our job in Geneva to prepare the ground and for example, on fish, get it to the point where there's an instrument that can be adopted by ministers, then we're collectively failing in our governance system.
Yoichi?
Thank you. After the wise words of Rufus and David, it's kind of hard for me to say something, but I think the senior officials' engagement is coming, and then I think it's important. I think there's as Rufus say, there's a problem of a deficit of trust with the WTO, and I think it has to be worked on two fronts. One is achieve at the MC12 what is achievable fishery subsidies to start with. I mean, these are the things I think it's achievable. But that alone doesn't give the WTO the trust that is missing at this point, which is, as David has wisely mentioned, what we want to do with the interface between the market and non-market economy system. I think it's illustrated clearly in the trade remedy agreements such as anti-dumping or subsidy and countervailing measures. I don't think that we can get the answer by the MC12 or any orientation. Maybe can't be too ambitious, but the process has to get started and start evolving. The ball should start rolling. And I think in this respect, the trilateral joint statement on subsidy was quite important, both in terms of trying to tackle the issue of what you want to do with the non-market element coming into the WTO system, as well as engaging the capital-based senior officials. The question of what you want, redefining with the prohibited subsidies, the question of a public body. All these are very important questions. We can talk about, in abstract about what you want to do with non-market economies, but we have to come down to some concrete stuff that actually the WTO system can help in order to find some sort of modus vivendi between the non-market and market economic system, and certainly subsidy is the place to start with. And as Rufus has alluded, in the Uruguay round and leading up to the WTO, the negotiations on trade remedies, either you take down anti-dumping or the subsidy and countervailing measures, the negotiations had to agree on the compromise language with a lot of ambiguities, and this is where perhaps the appellate body felt that they had to fill a gap. But certainly, these are ambiguous texts that negotiators know what they were negotiating, but not those who've joined the WTO after the WTO was set up. So you have to keep on working on these, clarify the definition, improve the language, and bring in new elements. And I think subsidy is a good place to start. If we can make progress by the MC12, all the better. But at some point, I think, working on the trial basis between Japan, US, and EU is one thing, and come to an agreement is very important. But you have to bring China at some point in this negotiation, and sooner the better. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us. And if you can just join me in thanking our panel too that traveled here for this.